It is April 1945. The Reich that once stretched from the Atlantic to the Volga is collapsing into dust. Berlin, once the proud heart of Hitler's empire, is now a ruin of smoke and thunder. Day and night, the city shakes beneath the endless bombardment of Soviet artillery. Each explosion sends shockwaves through the ground, rattling shattered windows, collapsing facades, and filling the air with smoke so thick that daylight itself seems to die. Civilians move like ghosts through the rubble, clutching children, buckets of water, or a final scrap of bread. The streets that once echoed with marching boots now run with ashen silence. Above them, red banners edge closer with every hour. The Third Reich is dying, and everyone knows it, everyone except, perhaps, the man who built it. Beneath the ruined streets, hidden under layers of concrete and steel, lies the Führerbunker, a maze of narrow corridors, sealed doors, and flickering lights. Here, Adolf Hitler lived out the final chapter of his rule. 23 feet underground, there is no sunlight, no sense of time. The air is heavy and metallic. The whine of air pumps replaces the wind. The only rhythm is the distant thunder of artillery and the ticking of clocks that no longer mark real hours. The bunker is a tomb disguised as a headquarters. Secretaries whisper as they type, aides hurry down dim hallways carrying meaningless reports, and guards stand motionless at their posts, listening to the muffled world above collapse. Cigarette smoke and sweat cling to the air. The walls drip with condensation. Somewhere deep inside, in a map room illuminated by dying lamps, Hitler stands over a large wooden table. Spread before him are maps covered in colored pins and red arrows, symbols of divisions that no longer exist. He stares at them for hours, mumbling to himself, shifting pins, giving orders that will never be obeyed. His right hand trembles as he points to imaginary front lines. The once commanding voice that shook nations now cracks and fades mid-sentence. To the few who still surround him, Goebbels, Bormann, and a shrinking circle of officers, he remains the Führer. They still call him my leader. They still salute. But behind the gestures, the illusion has crumbled. They know the truth. The armies he commands are ghosts. The empire he built exists now only in his mind. Above ground, the Soviets close in from every direction. Marshal Zhukov's troops have reached the city limits, and each hour brings them closer to the Reich Chancellery. Berlin is burning from the east to the west. Its train stations are crushed ruins, its hospitals overcrowded, its streets filled with soldiers too young to shave fighting alongside old men too frail to run. Hitler's Germany is no longer an empire, it is a graveyard. Yet, in the bunker, reality bends around him. His aides deliver fabricated reports of phantom counterattacks. He still believes, or pretends to believe, that General Steiner will gather what remains of the northern forces and launch a final blow against the Soviets. He speaks of Steiner's counterattack as if it were already underway. But outside, there is no Steiner army. There are no reinforcements. There is only chaos. Even the SS divisions that once swore loyalty unto death are scattering. For the first time, whispers of surrender reach the bunker corridors. Officers exchange glances they dare not voice. Hitler's private world grows smaller by the hour. His meals are taken in silence. His health is failing, his hands tremble, his gait is stiff. The man who once stood before adoring crowds now shuffles through concrete halls in a tattered uniform, muttering to himself about betrayal and fate. Eva Braun, still loyal, still smiling for him, tries to bring moments of normalcy, tea, small talk, a gramophone playing old songs, but even she can feel the weight of death pressing against the walls. The bunker hums with unease. Rumors move like shadows, Himmler is negotiating with the Allies, Göring has gone silent, entire divisions have vanished. Hitler refuses to believe it. Each new report he dismisses as lies spread by cowards. His temper flares without warning. One moment calm, the next he's pounding the table, veins swelling, shouting at maps as if they had betrayed him. Those in the room stand frozen, afraid to breathe. Outside, Berlin continues to disintegrate. Fires burn unchecked, entire neighborhoods vanish overnight, and the air raid sirens that once warned of danger now scream without pause. The city that once represented Nazi power has become the perfect symbol of its destruction. Inside, the Führer's world is shrinking to the size of a single room. The man who dreamed of a Thousand-Year Reich is now trapped in a bunker, surrounded by the ruins of his own making. And though he cannot yet admit it aloud, something deep within him has already broken. For years, Adolf Hitler had lived inside the myth of his own destiny. He believed himself chosen by fate, protected by history, untouchable by failure. Every defeat on the battlefield was explained away as temporary, every loss as a test of will. His ministers repeated the illusion until it hardened into dogma: the Führer cannot be wrong. Even as cities fell and armies vanished, propaganda films still showed him as the unbreakable leader, calm, decisive, eyes fixed on victory. But by the spring of 1945, that image had rotted from within. In the bunker, surrounded by concrete and fear, Hitler's control had become an echo of itself. The daily briefings were rituals, not strategy. Generals entered the map room knowing the numbers they carried meant nothing. Hitler refused to hear the truth, and so they fed him fragments of hope, lines on paper, imaginary units. He spoke of divisions that had been annihilated weeks earlier, of miracles that never came. Every word he uttered was a defense against reality. To admit defeat would be to admit that his grand vision, the Reich that was to last 1,000 years, had died in just 12. And so he clung to illusion, even as the walls trembled around him. The greatest of those illusions was the so-called Steiner counterattack. In mid-April, Hitler ordered General Felix Steiner to gather what remained of his forces north of Berlin and strike the advancing Soviet lines. It was to be, he declared, the decisive blow that would save the capital. His generals knew it was impossible. Steiner had no troops left, no fuel, no ammunition. The order was not a plan, it was a fantasy. But no one dared to say it. For days, Hitler spoke of Steiner's imminent assault as if it were already underway, describing movements that existed only in his mind. He imagined the Soviets driven back, Berlin rescued, the tide of war reversed. Even as the artillery above them grew louder, even as reports poured in that the Red Army had breached the city limits, he waited for news that would never come. When it didn't, he blamed betrayal. He accused his officers of cowardice, of conspiracy, of treason. The bunker became a theater of paranoia. He paced the corridors muttering names, convinced his generals had turned against him, that his destiny had been sabotaged by weakness. Yet outside the bunker, reality was brutally clear. The Red Army had surrounded the city from 3 sides. To the west, American and British forces had crossed the Rhine and were sweeping through central Germany. Hamburg had fallen, Nuremberg was gone, Munich under siege. Entire columns of refugees stretched for miles along the roads, fleeing from an enemy they had once been taught to hate. The empire that had once swallowed Europe was now being swallowed in return. Still, in his underground world, Hitler pretended command. He issued decrees to non-existent armies, demanding counterattacks from divisions that no longer answered the radio. His staff wrote down every word, because that was what they had always done. To question him was to risk his wrath, to obey him was to participate in delusion. The bunker's atmosphere thickened with silence. Officers avoided eye contact, secretaries wept in private, guards whispered about escape. And yet, despite the fear, some still believed. Goebbels, the loyal propagandist, still spoke of miracles, of destiny's turning wheel, of the Führer's inevitable triumph. He assured Hitler that the German people would endure, that the world would one day understand his vision. But even Goebbels' voice had lost its conviction. Behind the slogans was exhaustion. He had seen the photographs, the cities reduced to rubble, the faces of starving children. The Reich he helped build was collapsing into madness, and he was trapped in it. Inside the bunker, Hitler began to show the strain. His hands trembled constantly now, his body hunched and frail. The medication Dr. Morel fed him daily kept him moving, amphetamines, sedatives, injections for pain, but the effect was grotesque. He would rage for hours, then sit motionless in silence, staring at nothing. His eyes had lost their focus, his sentences trailed into whispers. Witnesses later said it was like watching a man dissolve while still alive. And yet, despite it all, he could not let go of control. He obsessed over details, troop placements, fuel shipments, orders for imaginary divisions, because control was all he had left. To rule meant to exist, to lose control meant to vanish. He dictated messages to phantom commanders, demanded oaths of loyalty, and forbade any talk of surrender. He insisted that Germany must fight to the last man, that every soldier, every child, must resist. He spoke of heroism, but what he demanded was sacrifice. The more the Reich collapsed, the more he demanded it bleed. Even in his isolation, he imagined history watching him, judging him, and he refused to show weakness. He still saw himself as the central figure of a grand epic, the man who would rise from defeat as Frederick the Great once had. In his office hung a portrait of the old Prussian king, the conqueror who had turned near certain defeat into victory 2 centuries earlier. Hitler often stared at it in silence, as if waiting for the spirit of history to intervene once more. But there were no miracles left. Only the sound of distant explosions, the dripping of condensation down the concrete walls, and the muffled cries of a city in its death throes. The illusion of control was crumbling, but Hitler clung to it with both hands. Because if the illusion died, then so did he. By the 3rd week of April, the walls of the bunker had grown tighter, the air heavier, and the circle around Adolf Hitler smaller. What had begun as a war council was now little more than a funeral vigil. Each day brought fresh reports of disaster, and each night, fewer men came to deliver them. Among those who remained, whispers began to circulate, whispers of surrender, of negotiation, of betrayal. For a man who had built his empire on loyalty, betrayal was the one thing Hitler could not forgive, and it came not from his enemies, but from within the ranks of his oldest followers. The first crack came from Hermann Göring. Once Hitler's chosen successor, Göring had spent the early years of the war basking in luxury while his Luftwaffe crumbled. By 1945, his name was a joke among soldiers. Yet, in the final days of April, Göring saw what Hitler refused to see, that Berlin was lost. From his refuge in southern Germany, Göring sent a telegram to the bunker, couched in respectful language but heavy with implication. He wrote that if Hitler was cut off and unable to lead, it was his duty, as the designated successor, to assume command of the Reich. It was a desperate attempt at continuity, a move born from panic rather than ambition. But when the message reached the bunker, it landed like a grenade. Hitler read it once, twice, then fell into a silent fury. His face, witnesses said, turned the color of ash. To any rational leader, Göring's message might have seemed practical. To Hitler, it was treason. His mind twisted the words into a coup. He slammed the telegram on the table, shouting that Göring had betrayed him, that his oldest comrade was plotting to steal his power. He ordered Göring's arrest immediately and stripped him of all titles. In a matter of minutes, the man once seen as heir to the empire was reduced to a criminal in exile. But behind Hitler's anger was something darker, fear. For the first time, he understood what that message meant. If Göring, his loyal companion since the early 1920s, no longer believed in his leadership, then the entire structure of faith that had sustained him was gone. The second betrayal came even sooner, and it cut even deeper. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, the man who had once sworn eternal loyalty, was secretly negotiating with the Allies through Swedish intermediaries. When the news reached Hitler, brought by his devoted aide Fegelein, the reaction was volcanic. He screamed that Himmler was a traitor, a coward, a Judas. He demanded Fegelein's execution, accusing him of complicity. In the dim corridors of the bunker, soldiers dragged the SS officer away, shots echoed minutes later. The paranoia that had simmered for months now boiled over. No one was safe. Hitler saw enemies everywhere, in his generals, his ministers, even among his secretaries. He spoke of being surrounded by cowards and liars, of being betrayed by destiny itself. The bunker descended into chaos. Orders and counter-orders flew. People avoided the Führer's presence unless summoned, and when they were, they stood stiff with terror. His face had become pale and sunken, his hair grey and greasy, his eyes darting, hollow. He no longer resembled the man who once hypnotized crowds with fiery speeches. Now his voice cracked, shrill, almost pleading. The myth was dissolving in real time. Outside, the thunder of artillery never stopped. Soviet forces were now only blocks away. The smell of burning oil and brick seeped through the ventilation shafts. Each tremor of the earth sent dust raining from the ceiling. But inside, the true collapse was psychological. With Göring and Himmler gone, Hitler's circle was reduced to a handful: Goebbels, Bormann, and a few faithful officers who no longer believed in victory but feared to show it. Every conversation revolved around betrayal. He ranted that the German people had failed him, that the army had disobeyed his genius, that fate itself had turned traitor. What none of them dared to say was that it was he who had failed them all. The once unstoppable leader had become a prisoner of his own delusions, trapped in a maze of anger and denial. His generals, those who remained, begged him to escape south to the Alps, where a so-called national redoubt could prolong the fight. But Hitler refused. "I will not run like a coward," he declared. "If the war is lost, I will not outlive the defeat of Germany." His words hung heavy in the stale air. Those around him realized then that he had chosen death. From that point on, the bunker was no longer a command post, it was a tomb. Every day, new rumors arrived of cities surrendering, of units laying down arms, of Soviet troops flooding into Berlin streets. Still, he clung to the illusion of control, issuing meaningless orders to divisions that no longer existed. His delusions had narrowed to a single thought: the world had betrayed him, and he would take it down with him. And so, surrounded by those too afraid to leave and too broken to protest, Adolf Hitler began the final descent into his own end. On April 22, 1945, the illusion finally shattered. In the map room of the Führerbunker, the last fragments of Hitler's fantasy crumbled under the weight of truth. Reports arrived confirming what his generals had long feared but dared not say aloud: Steiner's counterattack had never happened. The divisions Hitler counted on were gone, scattered, captured, or dead. There would be no miracle, no rescue, no turning of the tide. For a moment he stood motionless, staring at the map spread before him, the red lines of his army swallowed by Soviet arrows. Then, without warning, the fury erupted. Witnesses would later call it the most terrifying moment of the war, not for what it meant militarily, but for what it revealed of the man who had ruled Germany. Hitler's voice rose to a shriek as he struck the table with his fists, veins bulging, face contorted. He cursed the generals as cowards, traitors, incompetents. He screamed that the army had betrayed him, that the SS had failed him, that everyone had conspired to destroy the Reich. His body trembled violently, his hands shook uncontrollably. No one moved. The walls seemed to vibrate with his rage. Outside the room, secretaries pressed their hands over their ears, listening to the muffled roar of the collapse. When the outburst finally subsided, the silence that followed was heavier than the explosions above. Hitler sank into his chair, breathing hard, his eyes unfocused. "It's over," he whispered. "The war is lost." For the first time, the words were spoken aloud. No one answered. The air in the bunker felt suddenly colder, as if those words had stripped away the last warmth of denial. Slowly, he ordered everyone out of the room. When his aides returned, minutes later, they found him slumped, pale and trembling, his voice low, almost detached. He no longer raged, he merely repeated that the war was lost and that he would stay in Berlin to face his end. The decision had been made, not in defiance, but in exhaustion. From that day forward, the bunker moved in slow motion. Hitler no longer discussed strategy, he spoke instead of death, of loyalty, of destiny betrayed. His meals went untouched. He wandered the corridors at night, whispering to himself, pausing before the portraits of Frederick the Great as if expecting counsel from the dead. Outside, the Soviet advance thundered closer. Every hour, the detonations grew sharper, the ground trembled harder. Inside, the staff clung to mechanical routines, typing orders, answering phones that no longer connected to anyone, saluting a leader who no longer led. Secretaries wrote farewell letters home, soldiers drank in silence, and Goebbels rehearsed speeches he would never deliver. The bunker smelled of oil, smoke, and despair. Occasionally, Hitler summoned his officers, demanding reports on units that had ceased to exist. They brought him fabricated numbers, invented divisions, anything to fill the void. He listened with an expression somewhere between belief and indifference. The once master of orchestration now moved like an actor repeating lines in a play long past its closing night. His physical decline mirrored the ruin above. The tremor in his left hand had worsened, his walk was unsteady. Dark circles framed his eyes. He spoke of fate and justice, but the words were hollow, drained of conviction. Those who looked at him saw not the Führer of old but a frail, shrunken man trapped inside his own legend. Eva Braun tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, small dinners, polite conversation, laughter that echoed falsely off the concrete, but even she could feel the end pressing in. Outside the reinforced doors, Berlin had become an inferno. Soviet tanks clattered through the streets, flamethrowers turned buildings into towers of flame, and the sky glowed orange through the night. The people of Berlin, once commanded to fight for the Reich, now fought only to survive. Inside, the once invincible dictator could do nothing but listen as the empire he built disintegrated around him. His generals no longer argued strategy, they argued over who should attempt escape. Some begged him to flee south to continue resistance, but he refused. "My decision is final," he said quietly. "I will not leave Berlin." Those words sealed the bunker's fate. From that moment on, every person within its walls knew they were living on borrowed time. The commander who had once ordered millions into battle now waited for his own final command, a single act of control left to him. And as the Red Army's guns drew closer, shaking the ground like thunder from the underworld, even the most loyal among them began to wonder if history itself was demanding retribution. By April 28, 1945, the world above the bunker had ceased to exist. Berlin was a burning carcass, its skyline a jagged silhouette against a sky stained red by fire. The Soviets were only a few hundred meters away, their artillery hammering the city with relentless precision. Every explosion shook the walls, showering dust from the ceiling of the Führerbunker. Inside, time had lost meaning. Days blurred into a single endless night. Hitler's entourage moved through the corridors like ghosts, tired, hollow-eyed, performing rituals of loyalty that no longer served a purpose. The Führer himself was a shadow of a man, his body frail, his mind consumed by betrayal and decay. When news came that Mussolini, his old ally and mirror in tyranny, had been captured and executed by partisans in Italy, his body hung upside down in a Milan square, something inside Hitler snapped completely. He stared at the photographs in silence for a long time, then said coldly, "That will never happen to me." The decision was made. There would be no capture, no humiliation, no trial. Only control, even in death. That evening, he summoned his secretaries, dictating his political and personal testaments with trembling hands. The words were defiant and delusional, blaming everyone but himself, the generals, the people, fate. He insisted the war must go on, that his death should be seen as a sacrifice for Germany's future. His final message was a denial of responsibility, an echo of the lies that had built his empire. Afterward, he met with Goebbels and Bormann, thanking them for their loyalty. His voice was calm, almost gentle, as if he had already crossed a line between life and oblivion. Eva Braun remained by his side, smiling faintly, trying to make light of what they both knew was coming. She had refused every chance to flee. "I will not live without you," she had said, and Hitler, perhaps for the first time in years, seemed to believe her. On the night of April 29, in the flickering light of candles and artillery flashes, Adolf Hitler married Eva Braun in a brief, surreal ceremony. The witnesses signed the papers with trembling hands while distant explosions punctuated the vows. There was champagne, even laughter, small, brittle sounds that broke the suffocating tension for a few moments. It was the final illusion of normalcy in a world collapsing into ruin. The newlyweds retreated to their private quarters while the others lingered in silence, drinking to a future that no longer existed. Early the next morning, Hitler emerged one last time to bid farewell to the few who remained. He shook hands, thanked his secretaries for their service, and spoke quietly to his guards. They noticed his hand no longer trembled. There was a strange calm about him, as though he had finally embraced the inevitable. Around midday on April 30th, the bunker fell into a heavy stillness. Outside, Soviet shells crashed closer, their impacts shaking dust from the walls. Inside, Hitler and Eva retired to his study. The door closed softly. Moments later, those waiting in the corridor heard a muffled crack, a single gunshot, sharp and final. When they entered, the scene was as quiet as death itself. Hitler sat on the sofa, his head slumped, a pistol still in his hand. Eva lay beside him, motionless, a faint smell of cyanide in the air. The prophecy had fulfilled itself. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the bodyguard, obeying prior orders, wrapped the bodies in blankets and carried them up the narrow staircase to the garden above. The courtyard was a wasteland of rubble and smoke. Soviet shells burst nearby as the small group doused the corpses in gasoline and set them alight. Flames consumed the remains of the Reichsmaster, flickering against the grey sky like a funeral pyre for an empire built on lies. Inside the bunker, no one cheered, no one mourned. The silence was complete. Some wept quietly, others stared blankly, as if their minds had emptied with the man's death. Goebbels and his wife poisoned their 6 children the next day, then took their own lives. One by one, the remaining officers fled or surrendered to the Soviets. Above them, the Red Army stormed through Berlin, raising the hammer and sickle flag over the Reichstag, a symbol that would echo across the world. Below, in the concrete tomb where the Third Reich had died, only smoke and echoes remained. The war in Europe would end within a week, but the ghosts born in that bunker would haunt history forever. When the gunfire finally stopped, Berlin was no longer a city. It was a wound carved into the heart of Europe. Smoke drifted above the ruins where streets once ran, and the stench of death lingered in every cellar. The Third Reich had not fallen with a thunderclap of glory, but with a whisper of disbelief. Inside the bunker, the survivors moved like sleepwalkers, their faces grey with exhaustion and fear. Goebbels, the minister of propaganda, refused to flee. He gathered his wife and 6 children in a side room, whispering prayers over them as the walls trembled with the last bombardments. One by one, the children swallowed poison. Then he and his wife followed. It was not loyalty. It was obsession. Above them, Soviet troops advanced street by street, fighting for every intersection, every pile of rubble. On May 2, 1945, the last defenders of Berlin surrendered. Red banners rose over what was left of the Reich Chancellery. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. The Soviets, grim and methodical, descended into the bunker complex expecting to find Hitler alive or captured. What they found instead were ashes, fragments, and the lingering heat of burned bodies in the courtyard. The remains were scooped up, photographed, examined. Somewhere in that grey mix of bone and soot, they believed, lay the Führer of Nazi Germany. Yet even in death, his shadow refused to fade. Stalin ordered secrecy, fueling rumors that Hitler had escaped, by plane, by submarine, by some miracle of deception. For years, whispers spread across the broken world: Hitler in Argentina, Hitler in Spain, Hitler hiding in the shadows of history. To many Germans, the lie was easier than the truth. Believing he had fled preserved a fragment of the myth that had sustained them through ruin. But the truth was simpler, smaller, and more human than legend. He had died as he lived, afraid of weakness, addicted to control, unable to face reality. As the Soviets took photographs of the bunker's interior, half-eaten meals, scattered maps, blood-stained sofas, the full scale of the collapse became undeniable. Here, in this cold labyrinth of concrete, the grand illusion of the Thousand-Year Reich had ended in a few meters of dirt and fire. Outside, soldiers celebrated among the ruins, unaware that they were standing on the grave of a man whose madness had cost tens of millions their lives. Across the world, news of Hitler's death spread slowly. In London, church bells rang. In New York, crowds filled Times Square. In Moscow, Stalin remained silent. There was no triumph, only relief, a deep, exhausted exhalation that the nightmare was finally over. But the scars remained. Germany lay divided, its cities destroyed, its people starving, its identity shattered. The war that had promised glory had delivered only dust. And yet, in the strange way of human memory, the end of Hitler's life became the seed of endless speculation. The bunker turned from a tomb into a legend. Soldiers who had walked its corridors told stories that blurred fact and fear. Historians sifted through the debris for decades, searching for proof, for closure, for meaning. none ever found enough to satisfy the hunger for understanding. Because how does a world explain the rise and fall of a man who seemed to warp reality itself? The Soviet Union sealed the evidence, hiding the remains, guarding the story as if it still held power. Only fragments survived, a skull, a jawbone, a few ashes, locked away in Moscow archives. The rest was silence. For the German people, the reckoning had just begun. As Allied forces liberated the camps, the true face of the Reich emerged, piles of bones, hollow-eyed survivors, mountains of shoes and hair. The myth of the glorious war collapsed under the weight of horror. The same citizens who once cheered Hitler's speeches now faced the unbearable truth of what had been done in their name. In Nuremberg, the architects of that nightmare sat in the dock as film reels of their crimes played before them. The world demanded justice, but no verdict could balance the scale of what had been lost. Hitler's death had ended a regime, but not the consequences of its existence. His ideology lived on in whispers, in denial, in the uneasy silence of post-war Europe. Yet, in the ruins of Berlin, amid the rubble and smoke, something fragile began to grow, a determination never to return to that darkness again. The bunker where the Third Reich died was soon sealed, buried beneath the soil, its walls swallowed by time. But beneath that ground, in the dust of a dead empire, the echoes of April 1945 still linger, the footsteps of men who believed they were shaping destiny, and instead only hastened destruction. The war in Europe was over. The war for memory had just begun. In the months that followed the fall of Berlin, the world entered a strange silence, the kind that follows a scream too long sustained. The war was over, but its ghosts had only just begun to speak. Across Europe, the ruins of cities stood like open graves, each one a reminder of what belief, fear, and blind loyalty could destroy. Yet even as the world tried to comprehend the scale of the devastation, a new story began to take shape, one born not of truth, but of denial. It started as whispers among the defeated, that Hitler had not died in the bunker, that the corpse burned in the garden was a decoy, that he had escaped through secret tunnels, or flown out of Berlin in the last hour. In Argentina, in Chile, in the depths of the Andes, the rumors found new homes. Each one was different, but all served the same purpose, to make the unbearable more bearable. To believe the Führer had survived was easier than accepting that millions had followed a man who ended as a coward with a gun in his hand. Soviet secrecy only fed the myth. Stalin himself seemed to encourage it, insisting that no one was certain of Hitler's death. For years, intelligence agencies chased shadows, reports of submarines off Patagonia, sightings in Spain, an old man in Paraguay with piercing blue eyes. None were true, but truth no longer mattered. The myth of Hitler's escape became its own form of immortality. In post-war Germany, the silence was heavier. The once proud nation now stared into the mirror and saw what it had become. Cities lay in ashes, fathers were missing, and the weight of guilt pressed on every surviving generation. The name Hitler was no longer spoken in pride or reverence, but in shame and disbelief. Yet his image persisted, in newsreels, photographs, the whispered memories of those who had seen him in his final days. Historians began to unearth the records, the diaries, the testimonies, trying to separate the man from the myth. What emerged was not a monster of legend, but a human being, and that, perhaps, was the most terrifying truth of all. He was not a supernatural evil, not a demon born from the abyss, but a man who convinced millions to surrender their humanity for his illusion of destiny. The real danger was not his madness, but how easily it had become contagious. In films, books, and testimonies, his story became a mirror through which the world examined its own reflection. Decades passed, the bunker vanished beneath new buildings, the ashes of the Reich scattered by time. Yet every generation returned to that dark room beneath Berlin, asking the same questions: how did it happen, and could it happen again? The myths continued to shift, reshaped by fear and fascination. Some sought to humanize him, to find logic in his delusion, others turned him into a symbol of pure evil, stripped of all complexity. Both versions missed the point. The truth of Adolf Hitler was not found in the man himself, but in the millions who believed him, the machinery that enabled him, and the silence that followed him. The lesson was never about his death, but about how easily people surrendered to the idea that one man could define their fate. In the post-war years, as Germany rebuilt, The ruins became memorials, the bunkers became warnings, and the memory of 1945 transformed from trauma into testament. The Thousand-Year Reich had lasted barely 12, but its shadow stretched across a century. In the end, Hitler's legacy was not the empire he built, but the ruins he left, a living monument to the fragility of truth in the hands of power. And though his voice was silenced, its echoes lingered in every dictatorship, every cult of personality, every lie told in the name of destiny. The world learned that evil does not vanish with a single gunshot, it adapts, hides, waits. That is why history remembers not just the man in the bunker, but the silence that followed him. A silence that warns, even now, that the greatest threat is not one man's madness, but humanity's willingness to believe it. The war ended, but the silence it left behind was louder than the guns that preceded it. Across Europe, the spring of 1945 brought no joy, only exhaustion. Cities lay flattened, their cathedrals roofless, their streets filled with the echoes of a world that had torn itself apart. The victors walked among the ruins, trying to understand what victory even meant. The defeated stared at the ground, unable to speak the words that history demanded of them. In Berlin, flowers grew through the cracks of the Reich Chancellery's shattered courtyard, where the flames had once devoured their master. The bunker was sealed, flooded, and forgotten, but the memory of what had happened there refused to stay buried. Reporters, soldiers, and survivors all tried to capture the meaning of that moment, the death of a man who had once demanded the world kneel at his feet. Yet the true ending was not in his death, but in the silence that followed it. The silence of cities mourning the dead. The silence of mothers who never found their sons. The silence of a generation forced to confront its own reflection. For in that stillness, the world began to reckon with what it had become. The Nazi dream had died not with a shout, but with a whisper, and in that whisper was the sound of truth finally reclaiming its place from the lies that had drowned it. History would record the facts, the dates, the battles, the numbers, but what lingered were the faces, the stories, the scars that would never fade. From the ashes of the Reich rose a new world, divided by ideology, scarred by memory, but determined, somehow, to move forward. The image of Hitler's end became both warning and exorcism, a reminder that every empire built on fear eventually consumes itself, that every lie repeated long enough collapses under its own weight. Decades later, the ruins of Berlin would rise again, rebuilt from concrete and resolve. Children would play where tanks once rolled. Tourists would walk where soldiers once fell. But beneath their footsteps, deep underground, the ghosts of 1945 would still whisper, reminding the living that power without truth leads only to ruin. The fall of Hitler was not just the end of a dictator, it was the end of illusion, the moment when humanity saw, in brutal clarity, what happens when one man's madness becomes a nation's faith. And though time has dulled the sound of that final gunshot, its echo remains, not as fear, but as a warning. Because history, if forgotten, does not die. It waits. It listens. And when the world grows silent again, it speaks.